the topic for today, and as we talked about it internally at the Midwest Center, there's a rhythm to these things, right? Last month you had Dr. Renz talking about assessments organizational assessments and how you could utilize different assessments to better assess your organization, better make sense of what's going on in your organization, and make strategic decisions. Well, we're doing the same spirit today, it's just with a different topic, and the topic's financial management. I don't know if I'd call this a straight assessment, but it's a tool. What we're really going to talk about is a couple of tools on how to really get into assessing the financial, kind of taking stock financially of your organization. I won't go as far as to say this is a financial health assessment, because that's not the spirit behind it. It's more of a tool to help set up financial strategies that will help you kind of grow your organization and make savvy financial decisions. So without any further ado, what I wanted to kind of share with you first, this comes from Nonprofit Quarterly. John Pratt, who's a colleague of ours, friend of Dave's, from Minnesota, and he put this together, what, Dave, probably 7 years ago? 8?
Well, he started about 15, but he's been updating it. This one's probably about 3 to 4 years old.
Yeah, and so, but the reason I have it here isn't for, it's as much for illustrative purposes as anything else, but my guess is that when you think about your financial makeup at your nonprofit organization, it probably feels a little bit like this, right? It probably feels like this spider web. It feels like this kind of interconnected piece. It's not the simple retail operation of a for-profit organization where you have kind of one constituency group that makes up 99.9% of your revenues. You're pulling revenues from all over the place. And the federal government, state and local government, individuals, foundations, bequests, down the board, right? As well as fee for service. And part of the because the complexity of the nonprofit sector is what it is when it comes to revenue, we have to be a little more intentional and thoughtful. It's easy to get kind of pigeonholed down one path, and that kind of, to steal a term from poker, we can get pot committed on one resource strategy, and that can actually create more fragility for our organization. And so really the kind of purpose of today's discussion is to kind of take a step back. What could we do? How could we take a step back so that we could actually look at our financial situation and make sure that we're making good strategic choices for the betterment of our organization, for the sustainability of our mission as we move forward. And to that end, what I will tell you is that this whole financial discussion kind of centers around, these 3 topics. And one is capital structure, right? And when you think about capital structure, what you're really looking at is the relationship between assets, things you own, liabilities, things you owe, and revenues, right? So one of the things I always like to talk to organizations about when I'm fortunate enough to get called in to talk to them about capital structure is that if you own a building, right, it's yours. You also need to ensure that you have resource flow sufficient to maintain that asset, right? And so a lot of what capital structure gets into is the nature of the assets you own, and do you have a financial model that allows you to continue to sustain those assets? There are plenty of stories that exist out there of organizations that successfully completed a capital campaign, meaning they got their numbers, and have not, down the road 10 years, had significant financial issues associated with the structure, the building that they have, because they haven't been able to maintain it effectively. And that's a capital structure problem. And so one of the things that we're going to talk about is, based on the assets you have, do you have the right financial model to make sure that those assets are being maintained sustainably? We think about this in our personal lives when you buy a house versus choosing to rent a house or rent an apartment. We need to think about it from a business perspective also. Revenue dynamics, right? We're going to get it. This is what the bulk of our conversation is going to be about today. that not all revenues are created equally in the nonprofit sector. And in fact, a lot of times we talk about things as both revenue or support, right? So we don't even just look at, we actually have different names for inflows of resources to our organization. You know, I don't want to have a semantic conversation today. For the purposes of what I'm talking about, a revenue traditionally is viewed as like fee for service type of dollars, something you earn, versus support, which you could think of as grants or donations, things along those lines. But I will tell you though, for the purposes of our conversation today, when I say revenue dynamics, I'm talking about both revenues and supports. We can, you know, you will see as we look through and talk through the content, and you all add to the content, there are just different dynamics associated with those things. And then the last is asset fixity. And this is something just completely unique to the nonprofit sector. I would say, I guess government has a parallel, but we're not going to go into that with special funds. But the fact of the matter is, compared to other private sector organizations, the nonprofit sector is unique in its assets and how we categorize them with their fixity. So are they unrestricted, meaning you can use them, right, as you see fit? Temporarily restricted, meaning there is a time or use restriction on it, and then it becomes unrestricted, or is it permanently restricted? Endowments, right? Things that are, and this isn't the case very often anymore, but in museums, a lot of the exhibits were at one point permanently restricted, meaning they can only be used the way they're used, and it's a contract that dictates how those items are used. Really important to the conversation, very unique to the nonprofit sector, and part of the reason we really have to be proactive in constantly thinking about our revenue dynamics and our capital structure, and why we need to take some time out to map these things a little bit so that we can have good, strong strategic discussions internally, and have strategic discussions and make good strategic decisions based on where we pursue our revenues. So I just talked about it. Fixity of assets, right, and the level of the restriction. So when we think of level of restriction, right, I just talked about unrestricted, temporary restricted, permanently restricted. When we think about how fixed a given asset is, you know, low versus high, meaning low you can look at as a liquid type asset, versus high, which is much more difficult, right, to get rid of, to liquidate or to utilize from that perspective. As you think about this kind of 3x3 matrix, it wouldn't be a bad idea. I would actually encourage you with your organizations. You can do this obviously within programs, although you probably won't have a ton of assets associated with a given program. Most of you will do it at an organizational level. But if you do this with your organization, just take the time, sit down with a couple of your strategic leaders in your organization and just map out, you know, your different assets. You can do it basically from your balance sheet. You know, your balance sheet's actually organized in this kind of fixity model, right, from most liquid to least liquid items. So if you have an endowment, it's usually at the bottom of your assets on your balance sheet. But it's important to actually take stock of where these things are, and you could even throw percentages in there if you wanted to, right? So you could take a percentage of the amount of the cash as a total of all your assets, right? So if you had $1 million in assets and $100,000 in cash, you'd have 10% in this area. It's just a useful way to begin to think about how locked in are we with the things we hold. So you could actually have a very positive net asset situation from a mathematical, your assets minus liabilities equals net assets. You could have a very positive net, but those could all be very fixed, meaning you have very ability to utilize those assets in a way, in a unrestricted way, right? So they may be highly restricted and highly fixed. So they could be permanently restricted in the form of an endowment. So if we took an endowment, it both typically is going to be permanently restricted and highly fixed, at least the principle of it. And so you can't, it's not like you can really tap into that if needed to take advantage of an opportunity or to solve a problem that you have from a cash flow perspective. Those are just important things to think about as you begin to strategize about your larger revenue piece. The other thing I would encourage you to think about is when you do have assets that are highly fixed, like a building, even if it is unrestricted, I would encourage you to begin to think about how much revenue do we generate off of that asset, right? So is the asset a revenue generating item for us? And I would really love for this conversation to happen before you actually buy the building, but thank you for laughing, Dave. But the main reason for that is if we have an asset that's not revenue generating, I'm not talking about profit generating, I'm talking about revenue for our programs, then what we really have is something we own that just has a ton of liability that we have to be responsible for in the form of maintenance. If it's not helping us generate revenue for our mission, if it's not helping us be more sustainable, should we own it? Because it is important to remember that almost as you get into this fixity of assets, those assets have costs associated with them in the form of depreciation and maintenance and things along those lines. So when you look at your assets, also ask yourself the question, does this asset help us generate revenue? And I'll give you a good example. I'm under no obligation to mention them, but Operation Breakthrough is a good example, right? Where they have a building that they own, but that building's critical to their revenue generation and their mission fulfillment, right, of their organization. And it doesn't mean that when I say revenue generating, you're renting the building out, but that building, they are generating revenue through programming that's housed at that building. That's really where I'm coming at this from. So now as we begin to get into the dynamics of revenue, one of the things that I would like, and this is blank now, we'll fill it in a second here briefly. Very simple, again, a very simple 3x3, different from the asset, because now we're going to start mapping our revenue sources. And this is a little bit of art, or a lot of art, meaning you make the assessment on how reliable the revenue source is. And there's no hard and fast rule on this, but I would tell you that if it's the first time you've ever gotten that revenue, I wouldn't put it in the high reliability category. A classic example of things that I view as high revenue are if you have a donor family as a high reliability. The chances of your entire donor family leaving you in a given year are very low. I would bet, from a probability perspective, it's probably close to zero, if not zero, probability-wise. It also is a high autonomy thing, typically, right? So a high autonomy would be those revenues that are unrestricted, those dollars that are fungible. Fees for service fit into this category. Now, the irony to me is in the nonprofit sector, and maybe it's just envy, sector envy, is we always think about fees for service as these highly reliable, highly autonomous dollars. I would check that assumption. And the reason I would check, are they autonomous? I would say kind of. Typically, our fees for service are not collected at a profitable level. So what I mean by that is typically when we're collecting fee for service, we may be collecting, let's say a program costs us $100 a person to put on. We may collect $50 from someone to put that program on. So can we do whatever we want with that $50? Technically, yes. But really, that $50 is going to cover half the cost of that program, right? It's already baked into the strategy that you're doing. Is that a reliable source of revenue? Sure it is, but I wouldn't argue that it's any more reliable than a good donor. And we tend to look at donations kind of with this negative light, and we tend to look at revenue generation from a positive light. But the reality is, in some ways, they're very similar dynamics, a long-time donor and a consistent consumer. I would actually argue that you probably have more loyalty and stability with a long-term donor than you do with someone who's consuming your product or your service. From a reliability perspective, that's what we're beginning to talk about. How certain am I that I'm going to continue to get this? And what I would ask you to think about as you fill out the level of reliability is, how long have you received this? Use conversation and what I would call qualitative data from a research jargony perspective to to help you understand this. Let's say you've received money from the healthcare foundation, bad example, from the Block Family Foundation for the last 10 years. Without having a conversation with them, you might put them in the high category. However, with a conversation, you might find that their priorities are shifting. I'm sorry, high reliability. You may find their priorities are shifting. You may find that they're looking to invest in new programs, different strategy approach. That may change the reliability of that. So part of what, and this is why this becomes a team effort, and why if you're running a program, bringing your development officer in to kind of have this conversation, are they having conversations with like a foundation who makes a grant? And maybe, like I said, you've gotten it year after year after year. Are they having conversations with that foundation so that you can accurately fill this out and so that there aren't any surprises coming to you? We do it at the Midwest Center for organizations that support us. I mean, Dave and I have conversations regularly with the people who support us. And part of that conversation is informative, where we're reporting out on the things that we've done at the center. Other parts of that conversation are for us to kind of gain some degree of understanding on the reliability of those revenue streams moving forward. It's a constant process, and it's not 100%. So even if you could do this right, you could do it well, you could have the right conversations, document it appropriately, and things can still change on you. The point is that as you begin to lay this out, you will begin to see should you be diversifying some of your revenue sources? Are you too highly concentrated? Are you, even if you had a good revenue year, is it a precarious revenue year? Look, we're in strange times right now, right? There has been a lot of government stimulus. I hope that some of you have been able to, because of your missions, been able to take advantage of it. We don't know when this is going to end, but we can have some degree of certainty that it's not going to go on in perpetuity. So it's important to map this stuff out, to pay attention to it, so that then we can begin to have the critical conversations and the difficult conversations sometimes about where we choose to invest our human capital to continue to help us be sustainable. Now I told you we'd fill it out. Here we are. Here's some examples of what might fit into some of these areas. Okay. Level of reliability. Look at a one-year government project grant, right? Low reliability, low autonomy. It's going to be restricted to whatever that project is, and you know it's a one-year thing. You're not going to get it year after year after year. Bequests, fantastic. Difficulty is they're kind of tied to someone dying. So you have very little reliability on when it's going to happen. Big fan of estate planning. Think organizations should do more of it. Think it's imbalanced in the sector of who gets to take advantage of it more than others. That being said, so it's great when you can get them, but are you able to use those dollars in the right way versus, because knowing that the reliability of it is going to be pretty low, right? Restricted endowment, high reliability. That's why everybody wants one. However, very low on the autonomy structure, right? And so sometimes I think because of that first slide I put up, where the revenue matrix of the nonprofit sector is so confusing, we tend to get fixated on highly reliable dollars, especially if they're big dollars, at the expense of the autonomy of those dollars, right? So you can be asset rich and dollar poor. And endowments would be one of the ways you get there. Buildings would be the other. Finally, when you think about it, small regular contributions. I already mentioned this. I'm still a big fan of donor family. Any fundraisers on the Zoom right now will be happy that I'm saying this, I'm sure. It continues to be a critical lifeblood of a nonprofit organization. And my experience is that organizations oftentimes don't want to do the hard work to continue to grow that donor family. But when you think about, when you put it in the perspective of this framework of autonomy and reliability, how would you neglect it? How could you choose to neglect something that is both high reliability and high autonomy? I mean, that's the sweet spot. Now, the likelihood of you ever, unless you're a church, ever being able to fund your organization on on small regular contributions is very low. I guess political campaigns too. But the fact of the matter is, if you can continue to grow that as a percentage of your revenue portfolio, it puts you in a strategic advantage. At least the ability to utilize dollars in a way that is both flexible and to have some degree of certainty related to them coming in year after year after year.
Scott, someone asked about mill levy funds and where they would be categorized. And just so, if you know if you want to comment on that, and just any other guidance you might just give on how people do categorize, because there's probably all kinds of things like mill levy funds or stuff that people aren't going to be able to figure out where to put exactly.
Yeah, I think it's so. I think it depends on the year you're in the mill levy fund and the relationship you have with it, right? So there are some mills that have like an 8-year life to them. So in the first year of an 8-year life on a mill levy, I would have it as a high and a high. Like it almost typically those support general program operations. So it has a high level of autonomy, or at least a medium to high level of autonomy and a high level of reliability. As that mill's coming to expiration, and I'll talk about a different kind of mill in a second. As that mill's coming to expiration, it's going to end up in the low category because of the political process associated with it. It still is a medium to high in the autonomy, but that doesn't change. But the reliability does change. Now, there's other organizations that are funded consistently by organizations that are in charge of administering the mill. And in that scenario, I think you're in a medium to medium. I'm conservative when I'm doing my revenue planning. So I would say that's a medium reliability. It's definitely not low, and it's close to high, but it's a medium reliability. It's almost like a small family foundation that gives you dollars every year because you hit their sweet spot. They're restricted to where they can spend the dollars, and you may be in a space that you are one of the only providers who can allow them to distribute their dollars to have impact. And I think that's part of the calculation to me. Are you one of 100 or are you one of 10? And that would impact whether I put it as a medium or a high. And the autonomy of it is probably going to be, when it's coming from a source like that, is probably going to be a little lower. So it's probably going to be closer to a medium, in that it's probably going to a given program area versus all across all programs. So it depends on the nature of what you're getting it for. When you're applying like the Jackson County mental health levy, like you're kind of doing grants, and so it falls similar in that sense. Did you have something else, Cindy? Did I answer that?
No. Yes, I think so. If not, they'll let me know. I think it's someone who asked that can't speak, that doesn't have a voice. So yes,
no problem.
They just told me you did.
And I'll take a quick second and just say grants fit into the same. To me, grants kind of fall into the same category, right? And I mentioned having conversations with your foundation officers, and those are just things you need to continue to have conversations with. And they could be low reliability. If it was the first year I got a grant from a foundation, it would be a low reliability revenue stream for me. I don't have a relationship. The other thing is check the policies of the foundation you're working with, right? Or they may have policies that say we can only fund you for 3 years and then you have to take a year off. That would influence how depending on what cycle I'm in, what year of funding I'm in, would influence how I would look at this. All right, so you've mapped it out. So then what do you do? Why are we talking about this? Is it just that we map it out and put it on a wall? And obviously the answer to that is no. What I would argue is you do this and you don't do this alone. So this isn't an exercise where you just sit in a room by yourself and do it. Like, I think you put a leadership team, you have a leadership team or a strategy team together that comes together and does this. And you then begin to have conversations across your organization and external to your organization. How often have you sat, those of you who are leaders of your organization, sat in a board meeting and a board member fires off a revenue idea, right? Are you able to actually contextualize that within, do you have a framework to contextualize that for them and have a discussion with them so they don't lead you astray? How often have you found yourself in a growth period or needing to grow and needing to expand and to do more mission impact, and you're in a board meeting, and those board members who, even the good ones, aren't in your organization 100% of the time, right? They're not paying attention to what you're doing on a day-to-day basis. This is a way to begin to frame the conversation for them on why you're making the strategic choices you're doing. If you're going through a strategic planning process, I think this is actually a very useful tool to support that strategic planning process as you get into what type of strategies you're going to pursue. Now, let me be 100% clear. If you don't have, you may not have grant dollars. Not having them doesn't mean you start pursuing them. It should be part of a broader strategic conversation of, do we have the capacity to pursue them? A more common example is fee for service, right? Fee revenues that people say it was a big deal 10, 15 years ago. I still think it's a big deal, where people are like, well, we'll just start a social enterprise and we'll fund our organization that way. Very dangerous. Are you looking at it within the context of the entire picture of your organization? Where does it fit? How much relief would it give you? Those are kind of how you can begin to have these conversations with boards of directors. Same thing with staff, both helping them, empowering them to think strategically about your revenue development. I think too often, I'm going to give a little shout out to our development directors who may be on this call. Too often, I think we say, you're the development officer, go raise us money. And I don't think that's a healthy way to look at the revenue operations of your organization. The more people you have out there as revenue developers thinking about revenue development for your organization, the better and stronger your organization is going to be. And one of the ways you can do that is by framing up your financial picture using tools like this and having those conversations in programs, in departments. No ideas are bad ideas in the brainstorming session. You would hate to leave an idea on the table because you just didn't engage a valuable member of your organization in the conversation. When they bring background experience and relationships to the table that you may not be tapping. This is how you can utilize this with staff. Allow them to be a part of the process, allow them to be part of the problem solving, allow them to be part of the resource generation and creation process. And then allow your development directors to help orchestrate all of this as it goes on. Finally, individual donors, right? I think donors are changing, and they will continue to change. This is not new. Like, as every generation has its own characteristics, every individual has their own characteristics. But I do believe donors have become far more, they've become far more savvy, at least to ask questions related to, how are my dollars being used and how do they fit into the totality of your dollar picture? This is a way that you can frame it up, that you can have a very cogent conversation with a donor about how you are able to best use their dollars and speak to what their needs are. And not every donor's needs are going to be exactly the same. So I would encourage you to think about it from that. It's not one message. It's a set of messages that can be utilized to speak to different donors' needs and how they want their dollars invested in your organization. And I use that word intentionally. You can begin to have conversations with donors about investment, which I think is more popular of a term. It's definitely a more exciting term, I think, for a lot of donors, than just support, right? You're making an investment in this mission, and this is how you're doing it. And we are leveraging these other dollars that come from here, but you're giving us a little more. Let's say that donor's giving you more autonomy that'll allow you to take advantage of a new opportunity. That may be exciting for them. So this sets up an interesting array of conversations, but at the board level, the staff level, and with the donors, that I think can help you think more strategically, but also be more strategic. And my time has expired. And so now we'll be, continue to use the chat. Let's have a conversation. Obviously, comments are welcome as well. I'm curious to hear where people find themselves in the mix of thinking about how they think about their revenue generation and financial management. So let's have that conversation. We will be emailing the recording will get posted on YouTube so that anyone can see the kind of that first 25, 30 minutes. I would also say, Mark, I believe, sent out in with this PowerPoint also some tools that you can use that will help you kind of do this in your organization. I think in its most basic form, you can do it with the 3x3s, right? You can just make those and plot your different assets and revenues. I think the other piece to it that you can do, there are worksheets though that we have from the Midwest Center that get you into a more fine-grained, detailed analysis in the spirit of this approach.
Scott, we do have a question about when you realize that when you do that, maybe the 3D or the 3x3, you realize you need to adjust your revenue mix. How do you start doing that, make those changes?
Yeah, so the first thing I'd say is I wouldn't assume that you need to. I would ask, why is it that way, right? Like, obviously this model would say that revenue diversity is good, and I think that's oftentimes true. It's not always true. Kauffman Foundation doesn't have revenue diversity. They're doing just fine. It depends on who you are, what and what you're trying to do. And so I think the first question isn't how do I be different? I think the first question is, do I need to be different? And then the answer to that question, if the answer to that question is yes, and then the question is why? Like, why and how? And I think that would lead to how you would then begin to populate those other areas. So let's say I'm overly dependent on foundation dollars. Okay, yes, I need to be different. Foundations, we could end up with another pandemic or a 2008, 2009 financial crisis. It's going to change where foundations prioritize their dollars. Great. Then I have to think, what is the nature of my programs? Like, do I serve a population that could handle a fee-for-service model? I may not. And so I need to kick fee-for-services out of the way. Have I cultivated a donor family? If I haven't, why not? Do I have the capacity on staff to cultivate this? This has to be a constant, yo-yo is probably not the right analogy, but I do think it's a back and forth thinking about what do I need to do? What do I have the capacity to do? Because every revenue approach has an underlying capacity that you need to have in place to be successful. It's not simple to go out and start a business, like a revenue earning business. It's not simple to go out and start creating a donor family. Line of credit. Do you want to read that, Cindy, for those who aren't?
One question is a line of credit part of my revenue or support or part of my funding streams, or viewed differently somehow? So how do you look at a line of credit? What is that?
I look at it as part of my capital structure, right? So technically, it's a loan, right? That then provides cash to me to utilize as needed. So it's actually part of my capital structure. So where I've seen organizations get into trouble with lines of credit, I like lines. I think lines of credit are great. I think they're very useful. Nonprofit revenue is lumpy. But before I took on a line of credit, I would be asking, how am I going to pay it back? Right? Do I have an earned income stream that can pay it back? Am I using it because I have accounts receivable that I need to collect, that I have a longer accounts receivable collection timeline and account, right? So think about a school, right? I'm waiting on tuition dollars, and so I'm using it as a float to cover money, but I know the tuition dollars are coming. Do I know that I have donations? Am I using it because my development cycle creates a gap in my cash needs for the year, and I know that I have dollars coming in that I can pay it off with? I think it's so important. I've seen lines of credit just sit on people's balance sheets for decades because they took on the line of credit without actually thinking about how they're going to pay it off, and then they're just constantly in that negative cycle.
Scott, if we could jump back just a little bit to talk again about that revenue mix. So what types of questions do you ask yourself even to start to think about if you need to do that, and just even to get to that point? So
I actually think it should be part of every annual planning process of, do we have the right revenue mix, right? Do we, is our revenue mix allowing us to be sustainable? So assuming I have a mission that I want to sustain, that's really the first question. Do my revenues sustain? Do they? And I actually didn't mean that to be as like snarky. Like there are such things as time delimited nonprofits, right? Where I'm going to put myself out of business in 5 years. But if I assume that that's not the case, do I have revenues that I think are sustainable? The second thing I'm going to look at is, I do think reliability is important. I know I may have sounded like I was poo-pooing it a little bit. I'm not. I think reliability is probably the second thing. Do I have reliable sources of revenue? My only issue with reliability is to not get overly fixated on it. The third piece I would ask is, what's my autonomy makeup? So I would actually do it in that order, right? Like, do I need, a different mix? How do I look from a reliability perspective? And then finally, autonomy. And unless I can answer positively to all three of those, I probably need to consider pursuing additional changes in revenue. Now, there's nothing wrong with starting small. And the other thing I would say you have to think about, again, that comes into play if you do decide to pursue a different form of revenue, is the capacity. Do I have the capacity to pursue that revenue currently?
I think this kind of goes with what, and I know I'm skipping around for you that have asked questions, but I think I have them all here, so we'll get to them. But when you talk about diversity, there is an administration capacity that can apply there. So, you can't have, I'm trying to read this whole thing. You can't have some of, federal grants when you don't have a grants team. You can't do fees for service when you don't have an invoicing processing. So some of that stuff, so talking about that a little bit, not burning your staff out, making them do these things that they don't.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And so I don't think it should be, ready, shoot, aim, right? I think that, if you're going to pursue federal grants and that's an important space for you to do it, it makes sense strategically that federal grant dollars are opening up. Then I think you need to build that capacity, right? You can do it through trainings, I'm just saying it because she's on the screen right now, but Lisa Joya, who works with us, there's people like her that you could bring in to help build, train the capacity of your organization to make sure you have the right financial operations in place. That would be part of that federal grant team. We have a colleague at the university, Brent Never, who's actually done some research on federal and state dollars and the impact on nonprofits. And when you talk about reliability of government dollars, the only thing I'd say is buyer beware. Governments have the ability to say, you have to keep doing the work and we're not going to pay you because we don't have the money. At one point, I think the state of Illinois was 18 months behind on payments to nonprofit organizations for work. And so the other thing I would say is, if I was going to pursue a not only is there the capacity issue of slowly building up that capacity, you're probably looking at at least a 2-year period to build the internal capacity. I also want to make sure that I have the capital structure to support a federal grant. Meaning, do I have excess cash that I can float, that if they don't pay me, that I can handle that gap in payment? And those are the things you need to look into when you're looking at pursuing a new revenue source. Is, do you understand all the facets of it? How often does government money get delayed? How often does foundation money get delayed? How often, if it's fee for service, how often do people drop my service and pick up a different service? Those are all the things you need to be thinking.
Talking a little bit, there's a few questions about COVID and just the unpredictability of right now. One being that it's hard to, a major event was canceled. And so it's hard to suddenly bring in like a fee for service thing for this huge amount of money that was lost due to COVID. Another, just maybe you had income coming in, a revenue stream coming in that got canceled kind of, and now it's coming back, but you don't know how quick it's coming back. And so I think the questions are more around just how you plan for the unpredictability, really.
Yeah, so the short answer on the pandemic is I think it's a great question related to an exogenous shock, a big outside shock that's unplanned for. And how do you solve for that? And I'm sorry, my answer is I don't know. And COVID in particular, and I was we were joking around a little bit at the start about when we started the navigation series of how long we thought it would last. There's no reason to believe that 2021 financially for nonprofits is going to be any different than 2020 was, when you just think about those dollars coming back into the space. Where this fits into large, but this is where the strategy becomes why mapping it's important. If I have high levels of low reliability, so if I know most of my revenue sources are low and I don't know when they're coming back, I want to get ahead of it from a cost management perspective. This is probably not the answer people wanted, but I probably want to start controlling costs earlier rather than later. And I'm going to be inherently conservative on my spending and on my build outs and my growth plans until we can get some degree of certainty. I would also point back to the very first session we ever did on the navigation series. And it kind of relates to this topic, which is in times of these kind of drastic uncertainties, the best strategy is to cut to the core. Figure out what your core is, cut the things on the outside that are peripheral, and invest in the core. And so if I was looking for revenues, to kind of get to the answer here, if I was looking for revenues, I would be looking for revenues that are in the core of my program. I would not be looking to create new revenues on things that are kind of tangential or light or related to the core. They would have to be part of my core. Invest in the core right now. So you may have less programs, but those programs you have are growing because you're innovating and investing in the core versus trying to do more things. I think it's a natural human reaction that when we're fearful, we do more things, not less. And the actual right behavior is to do less and not more, but just invest more in that core. So I would be looking for revenues that tie directly to my core program and my core capacities.
Sorry, Scott. Marvin, do you want to ask your question? I'm afraid I'm going to butcher it. It's about trust and working on projects for a while. Marvin, are you there that you could ask Scott directly? No. Scott, he asked I don't know if we want to do it. Well, he's not here anyway. He asked a question. It's about what about a project that's been worked on for years and institutional decision makers are in the process of launching a trust? What would be, and I don't know the definition of that exactly. That's kind of why I wanted Marvin to.
Yeah, it's just like it's like what the community foundation has. Irrevocable.
Okay, so it's a standard definition. Okay. What would be the most sophisticated input or recommendations as this new trust is getting ready to launch?
They're launching it for that organization?
Yeah, that's the way I'm reading it.
Yeah, so it's actually, so I've actually been doing some of this with the Royals right now. Before you actually set up a fund of any kind, I actually think you want to think strategically about what you want those dollars to go to. Not to be a broken record, but if you laid out where your revenues are here and the fixity of them, the flexibility of them, even though that trust is going to be inherently not flexible, what you could do is have it target an area where you need dollars that you aren't able to flex money to, right? So, or you target it to an area where you have dollars that are flexible that you could then move to the other areas of your organization that aren't receiving dollars. So I would look at it strategically, and I would ask, again, make a strategic investment in an organization by ensuring that the dollars go to this area, to an area that is hard to raise for.
Thank you. That was excellent. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, absolutely.
When you're considering beginning a fee for service, do you have resources showing all the things that you need to consider? And we've got a couple of questions about resources. So that's one about, starting something.
You can answer that, Cindy. I mean, that's what, like Levitt gets into. I mean, you probably have a better grasp on the current resources we have on fee for service type programming.
I can look into that. We don't have anything.
Yeah, I mean, so here's the things that come off the top of my mind. What is the marginal cost of doing the fee for service program? What's the marginal revenue, right? So what's the additional unit of cost for, what's the cost for producing an additional unit of whatever that product or service is? What's the revenue I collect on it? What is the indirect cost of that area? So, there's a famous salad dressing example that I always go into, that an organization was a homeless organization started making salad dressing. I guess they were inspired by Paul Newman to make additional money for their organization. It wasn't successful. They couldn't figure out why. They were selling it for $4.50 and they thought it cost them $4 to make it. They brought in a consulting firm. The actual cost to make it was $94. So they were actually losing about $89.50 on every bottle of salad dressing. And because they didn't look at the indirect cost of making the salad dressing also. So indirect cost is really important. It's not something we typically think about. And then getting back to the grants question, do I have the financial wherewithal to run a fee-for-service business internal capacity-wise? It's just a different model.
I do think too, I mean, what do you want to do? And just to get a fee for service, there's income is not, is tough to do. But is there something you're already doing that you could just expand to get fees for? Is there something that's kind of a low hanging thing? So thinking through that a little bit can always be helpful.
And is there a market that can pay for it?
Yeah.
Right. Somebody asked earlier about what is a third party payer for a nonprofit? A third party payer is typically in healthcare. Insurance companies are considered a third party payer. Scholarships in schools could be viewed as a third party payer. It's not common outside of a couple of industries. And then real quick to Scott Cooper, and then I'll answer whatever else you have, Cindy, is if I had a line of credit, I would not let it go. Even if it's always nice to have in the event of an emergency. I don't want to go through that reapplication process. If you have it and they're letting you use it, and if there's a period of which you can do it and not pay a interest on it, right? I might use it every so often just to keep it active, as long as I'm not incurring costs to use it. I don't know, Lisa, do you disagree with me on that? You're our financial guru. Keep it if you have it.
I think it makes a lot of sense to keep it, not that you're borrowing against it, but that you have that as an option. So I think that makes a lot of sense.
Great.
There's questions kind of running around, Scott, just about how you categorize, how you organize all this stuff. So how you manage the donors and the revenue streams and how you manage that. Do you have any recommendations? Bloom app, I think, and Salesforce were offered. Also, I think people are still kind of struggling with trying to figure out a little bit how you categorize this. And what about PPP money?
Yeah.
PPP grants, and just, again, how you put things in the right places.
Right, so PPP money is very restricted. I mean, it has to be used on salary. It has to be used on employees. And I would consider it not reliable, right? So it's very fixed and very unreliable. I mean, I don't know, there's been 2 rounds. I don't know how successfully people have been at getting the second round. So I think it was a great resource. I think it was a fantastic idea by the government to do it. But that's where it would fall for me. The other piece, I think you have to do your research. I think you have to do research on your own donors and own giving patterns. I don't think there's a universal standard that I would apply personally. So like I might go back and do research and say that if someone's given to us for 3 years, they don't stop giving to us, right? And so once someone hits that 3-year threshold, then I may make them very reliable, because my research shows that 90% of people who give for 3 years continue to give, or that's the point that people drop off between years 2 and 3 if they're going to drop off. If someone gave to me 1 year, I wouldn't consider it reliable at all. Again, and if they gave 2 years, they may be a medium, and then once they hit 3, they would go up. But don't use those standards. Go back through Salesforce and other tools, other databases that you have, to see what the giving pattern is, and let that dictate how you categorize some of these things. I would put foundations in the same category, although I have a very hard time ever putting a foundation, no matter who they are. And I love them. I think they're great. I would have a very hard time because I've just seen it too often where they've switched strategies. We've lived that a couple of times, Dave. Maybe I'm just expressing some trauma. Did I miss anything, Cindy?
No, I think you touched on this. Just that it's hard to get a financial credit. This is more of a comment. It's hard to get a line of credit when you need it. So, you know, but get
Yeah.
so having it there maybe in place.
I actually have an opinion on this. So
No comment.
what this goes into the larger piece of what do you do, like how do you build these revenue streams? And one of them is build relationships with banks early, right? And be intentional about the relationships with the banks you build, right? So if I'm, let's say I'm sitting here today, I don't need a line of credit, but things are still precarious. The statement's 100% right. If you're at a point where you need it, you're not a good lending risk. And so don't get to that situation where you don't have a relationship with a bank that that you're in that unfortunate position where I need it or else I'm going out of business. You're just not a good lending risk if you need it. So think strategically now of where you stand today and try and get those relationships in place. Some banks are better than others. Talk to your other nonprofit colleagues, by the way, about what banks they use and they have good relationships with. Some banks are more willing to give lines of credit to nonprofits than others. It's never going to be super easy for a nonprofit, but there are plenty of banks that do it. There are other funding debt tools other than lines of credit that you could look into too, like the IFF is one that comes to mind that does debt financing for nonprofit organizations. So line of credit isn't the only tool, and it may not be the best tool depending on the situation you're in. Told you I had an opinion. Other thoughts, questions, comments are appropriate. Great. Well, oh, there's one more that just popped up.
It's Mark.
Oh, thanks, Mark.
Just posting some, yes.
Well, look, I really appreciate getting to spend this time with you all this morning. I know we kind of hit on a variety of, we kind of, you know, the model, the core model that I spent the kind of first half talking about, again, I think is very, very useful to starting conversations, and those conversations will go a long way once you have the initial information together. But there is a process of getting the information together that, in my opinion, is worth the time investment. I saw the question on Cash Apps. I'll get to that in a second. And so the only thing we aren't going anywhere. If you want, you know, we can build a workshop in such a way that we could actually go through the process of kind of workshopping through some of these kind of concepts, filling out these kind of grids. If that's something you want, let Mark know. He'll be more than happy to tell us. We actually have some new technology at the university that we're really excited about, called Rooflex. You'll be hearing more from us about this, but it actually gives us the ability to have people in the classroom and virtual at the same time, where they can participate seamlessly. So you can participate virtually seamlessly, and we could have people in the room at the same time. We're very excited about that investment and what it'll mean for us being able to connect with all of you. Question on Cash Apps, really simple. Yes, use them, right? I think it's a generational thing and it's a shift. I'm not that young, but I don't carry cash anymore. And if you want me to donate to you spontaneously, you better have a Cash App or else you're in trouble. Half the time I don't even have my wallet on me anymore. I have a driver's license and a phone. And I just think it's the way that things are going. People always, I am not one of these people who would ever hesitate to pay credit card processing fees either. I think that is, you know, you're penny rich and pound foolish with some of those approaches. Like, I think it's worth the processing fee if it makes it easier on people to give you money. I'm a firm believer that you should make it as easy as possible for people to give you money. And so, big fan of Cash Apps. Anybody had I don't know anybody who's had a bad experience with them. I know that there was an issue with Facebook giving not that long ago, where the money went to the wrong organization. But
This may be a question for everybody out there. Any recommendations on accounting software? So I don't know if you want to weigh in on that, Scott. I know you don't do a lot of that yourself.
I don't want to weigh in on that.
Okay. Anybody else want to weigh in on that?
I do not have an opinion on. I guess QuickBooks is pretty common. Lisa, can I lean on you? Do you have an opinion?
Yep. And also, if somebody wants to know if Lisa's supportive of cash apps.
I'm a dinosaur, so I'm more into checks, but Scott's a great teacher to get us into today's world in the 21st century. And QuickBooks, I think, is helpful software for smaller organizations. The larger organizations, the more complex, might need a different software. But I think even I have a client that's like a $10 million organization in terms of revenue sources, but primarily program revenue, and they're still on QuickBooks and it works great. But a $5 million nonprofit that has a multitude of restricted grants, sometimes QuickBooks is not the best solution in going forward. So I think higher level accounting software can be more helpful for more complex not-for-profits. So, and it really just depends on the nature of your team also, because I think you have to tie those two together in terms of which software you're going to move forward to.
Just making sure everybody saw Sammy's comment there. So I don't know if it's APLOS or APLOS, is geared for nonprofits, and there's a reduced rate, I guess, if you have a budget under 50,000. It's in the chat if you didn't see it.
Well, we really appreciate you guys spending the morning with us.